Did you know that the Soviet Union received thousands of tons of buttons from the United States during the war? Or that an officially atheist state suddenly reopened thousands of churches to boost morale? The story you think you know about the Eastern Front is probably just the outline. The details are where the real picture emerges. It's a story of entire factories packed onto trains and moved 1,000 miles east. It's a story of women flying flimsy wooden planes in the dead of night. It's a story of mathematicians calculating artillery tables and geologists finding new oil fields just in time. What really kept the Soviet war machine running? How did a nation that had just gone through immense internal turmoil manage to mobilize on such a staggering scale? And what secrets about its massive intelligence operations are still locked away in sealed archives? The answers aren't always what you'd expect. Number 25 was the war in the East really over in May 1945. Most people think the story of the Soviet Union and the war ends in Berlin in May 1945. The iconic images are of soldiers in the German capital. But that wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. A massive and largely forgotten military operation was just about to begin on the other side of the world. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Joseph Stalin had made a promise to the other Allied leaders. He pledged that the Soviet Union would enter the war against the Empire of Japan within 3 months of the German surrender. And he was serious. This wasn't a minor skirmish, it was a full-scale invasion. The operation was called the Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation, often referred to by historians as August Storm. It began on August 9th, 1945, exactly 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. The scale was immense. The Soviet Union moved over 1.5 million troops, more than 5,000 tanks, and almost 28,000 artillery pieces thousands of miles across Siberia. This logistical feat alone was incredible. Much of this movement was done in secret, catching the opposing Japanese Kwantung Army completely by surprise. The commander of the operation was Marshal of the Soviet Union Alexander Vasilevsky, one of the most capable military leaders of the time. The plan was a classic double envelopment, a giant pincer movement across a front that stretched for over 4,000 kilometers. Soviet forces attacked from the west, the east, and the north, plunging into Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, once a formidable force, was now a hollow shell. Its best units had been transferred to fight in the Pacific. It was ill-equipped and unprepared for the speed and power of the Soviet assault. The historian David Glantz, in his book August Storm, the Soviet 1945 Strategic Offensive in Manchuria, details how the Soviet forces used their experience from the European front to devastating effect. They advanced rapidly, bypassing pockets of resistance and driving deep into enemy territory. Within days, the Japanese defenses collapsed. The impact of this operation was profound. While much attention in the West is focused on other events of August 1945, many historians, such as Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, in his book Racing the Enemy, argue that the Soviet invasion was a primary factor in Japan's decision to surrender. The swift collapse of the Kwantung Army demonstrated that there was no hope of continuing the fight. The Soviet Union also secured significant territorial gains, including the southern half of Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands, which remain a point of contention between Russia and Japan to this day. The war in the East didn't end in Berlin, it ended in Manchuria with a massive, decisive, and often overlooked campaign. What do you still not know about this final act? How much did intelligence from spies on the ground in Manchuria contribute to the operation's success? What would have happened if the Kwantung Army had been at full strength? And how might that have changed the map of post-war Asia? And what political calculations were made in Moscow about the post-war division of Korea, a division that began as Soviet and American troops advanced from opposite directions? Number 24, how did American Spam and Studebakers fuel the Red Army? The story of the Soviet war effort is often told as one of pure self-reliance. It's a narrative of T-34 tanks and homegrown resilience. But that story is incomplete. A crucial and often downplayed part of the equation was the Lend-Lease program from the United States. This wasn't just a handful of supplies. It was a torrent of material that had a direct and profound impact on the Soviet ability to wage war. Stalin himself later admitted, "The United States is a country of machines. Without the use of those machines through Lend-Lease, we would lose this war." The numbers are staggering. The United States sent over $11 billion worth of aid, which would be hundreds of billions in today's money. This included over 400,000 trucks and jeeps. This is perhaps the most critical part of the aid. The Soviet military was chronically short of motorized transport. These American vehicles, particularly the rugged Studebaker US-6 trucks, gave the Red Army a level of mobility it had never possessed. They were used to transport troops, tow artillery, and carry supplies. The historian Albert L. Weeks, in Russia's Lifesaver, argues that this newfound mobility was a key factor in the success of major Soviet offensives from 1943 onwards. Suddenly, the Red Army could move vast formations quickly, executing the deep battle operations they had theorized about but lacked the hardware for. But it wasn't just trucks. The aid included nearly 15,000 aircraft, including the Bell P-39 Airacobra, which became a favorite of Soviet fighter aces like Alexander Bakryshkin. Over 7,000 tanks were sent, though they were generally less valued than the Soviets' own designs. The aid that truly kept the machine running was often less glamorous. The U.S. sent over 300,000 tons of aluminum, a critical material for aircraft production that the Soviets desperately lacked. They sent millions of miles of telephone wire, entire railroad locomotives, and thousands of rail cars, which were essential for rebuilding the shattered Soviet transportation network. And then there was the food. The Red Army and the civilian population were facing starvation. The U.S. sent millions of tons of foodstuffs. The most famous was Spam, which became so ubiquitous that the Russian word for it is still often just Lend-Lease. They also sent flour, sugar, and canned goods. This aid freed up the Soviet agricultural sector to focus on feeding the front lines and prevented a complete collapse on the home front. It's not an exaggeration to say that the Red Army marched on American food and drove on American wheels. This doesn't diminish the Soviet sacrifice, but it places it in a more accurate context of international cooperation. What details about the Lend-Lease negotiations are still locked in Kremlin archives? How did local commanders on the front actually adapt to using American equipment, and what were the unwritten training manuals they created? And beyond the official numbers, what was the real scale of black market trading of Lend-Lease goods among civilians? And how did it shape the wartime economy? Number 23. Could a wooden crop duster become a terrifying weapon? Imagine a quiet night on the Eastern Front. A German soldier on sentry duty hears a faint sound, like a gentle whoosh, or the rustling of wind through canvas. He sees nothing, then suddenly explosions erupt around him. This wasn't a high-tech bomber. It was a Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane made of wood and fabric, originally designed in the 1920s as a crop duster and training plane. And it was being flown by an all-female air regiment. They were the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and the German soldiers gave them a nickname, the Nachtwechseln, or Night Witches. The formation of 3 female air regiments was the brainchild of Marina Raskova, a famous Soviet aviator. In the desperate days of 1941, she convinced Stalin to authorize their creation. The women who volunteered were young, many in their late teens or early 20s. They faced skepticism and were initially given outdated equipment, like the Po-2. This plane was slow, with a top speed slower than many cars. It was flimsy and offered no armor for the pilot and navigator. But these weaknesses became their strengths. The Po-2 was so slow that it could fly below the stall speed of faster German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, making it an incredibly difficult target to shoot down. Its small size and wooden construction made it hard to detect with radar. The strategy of the Night Witches, under the command of Yevdokia Bershinskaya, was ingenious. They flew only at night. They would fly in groups, with the first planes attracting searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, while others slipped through to the target. Their most famous tactic was to idle their engines near the target and glide silently to their bomb release point. This eerie silence, followed by a sudden explosion, was terrifying for the troops on the ground and earned them their nickname. The conditions were brutal. The 2-person crews flew in open cockpits, suffering from frostbite in the harsh winters. They flew dozens of missions in a single night, as the plane could only carry a small bomb load. By the end of the war, the regiment had flown over 24,000 combat missions. More than 30 of its pilots were decorated with the nation's highest honor. Figures like Nadezhda Popova flew over 850 missions. The story of the Night Witches is a powerful example of how ingenuity and courage could turn a seemingly obsolete piece of technology into an effective and feared weapon. It's a story largely written out of the more male-dominated histories of aerial warfare, but what do we not know? What were the psychological coping mechanisms these young women developed to handle the immense stress of nightly combat in such vulnerable aircraft? How much of their tactical doctrine was developed by the women themselves versus handed down from male commanders? And are there still undiscovered personal diaries or letters from these pilots that could give us a more intimate look into their daily lives and fears? Number 22, how do you move an entire nation's industry on trains? In the summer and autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union faced a catastrophic situation. The invading German forces were advancing rapidly, threatening to capture the country's most vital industrial heartlands in Ukraine and Western Russia. The loss of these factories would mean the end of the war effort. The response was one of the most astonishing logistical operations in human history: the wholesale evacuation of Soviet industry to the east. This wasn't just moving a few key plants, it was a mass migration of machinery, workers, and entire communities. The scale of this undertaking is difficult to comprehend. Between July and November 1941, over 1,500 large industrial enterprises were packed up and moved. This involved dismantling massive factories, piece by piece, loading heavy machinery onto over 1.5 million railway wagons, and transporting them hundreds or even thousands of miles to the Ural Mountains, Western Siberia, Central Asia, and the Volga region. The famous Kharkov tractor plant, which produced T-34 tanks, was completely evacuated. So was the Zaporizhzhal steel plant. The Ilyushin Aircraft Design Bureau was moved from Moscow to Kubyshev. This was a human drama as well as an industrial one. Millions of skilled workers, engineers, and their families were evacuated along with their factories. They traveled in harsh conditions, often in unheated cattle cars, with little food or water. When they arrived at their destinations, they often found nothing but open fields or primitive settlements. They had to rebuild their factories from scratch, sometimes in the middle of a brutal Siberian winter with no proper shelter. Stories abound of machinery being set up in the open air, with workers building walls around it as it began production. The historian Catherine Meredal, in her book Ivan's War, vividly describes the immense human cost and the sheer determination involved in this process. The success of this evacuation was absolutely critical. By the spring of 1942, these relocated factories were not only operational, but were out producing German industry in key areas like tanks and aircraft. The new industrial base in the Urals, nicknamed the Tankograd Tank City, became the arsenal of the Soviet Union. This incredible feat of organization and sacrifice ensured that the Red Army would have the material it needed to continue the fight. Without this eastward shift of industry, the war would almost certainly have been lost in its first year. It was a brutal, chaotic, and desperate gamble, but it paid off. What unrecorded stories of sabotage and resistance occurred during the frantic dismantling of factories in the path of the advance? How were the decisions made about which factories to move and which to leave behind? And what political battles were fought over these life or death choices? And what was the long-term environmental and social impact on the remote regions that suddenly became centers of heavy industry overnight? Number 21. Did the Soviet Union have its own Alan Turing? While the story of the Bletchley Park codebreakers is well known in the West, the Soviet Union had its own sophisticated signals intelligence and cryptography operations that remain far more obscure. They were not just on the receiving end of intelligence, they were actively breaking complex codes and running elaborate deception campaigns. The world of Soviet codebreaking was highly compartmentalized and shrouded in secrecy, not just from the outside world, but from other parts of the Soviet government itself. The main organization responsible was the Gushpa, the main director of special service, a part of the NKVD. And they had significant successes. For example, Soviet cryptanalysts made progress against the German Enigma machine, though they never achieved the industrial scale breaking that the Allies did at Bletchley Park. Their work was often slower and more piecemeal. However, they had a major advantage: captured codebooks. The rapid advances and chaotic retreats on the Eastern Front meant that a significant amount of German code material was captured intact, providing shortcuts that didn't require pure mathematical genius to solve. The historian David E. Murphy, in his book What Stalin Knew, highlights several instances where captured intelligence gave the Soviet high command clear warnings of upcoming German offensives. Beyond breaking enemy codes, the Soviets were masters of what they called maskirovka, or military deception. This was a broad doctrine that included everything from camouflage and concealment to complex operational feints designed to mislead the enemy about the time and place of an attack. Operation Bagration in 1944, a massive offensive in Belarus, was a masterpiece of maskirovka. The Red Army used dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and concealed troop movements on a grand scale to convince the German High Command that the main summer offensive would be in the south, towards Ukraine. When the real attack came in the center, it shattered the opposing army group. The mathematical talent behind these efforts is less personalized than in the West. There isn't a single celebrated figure like Alan Turing. The work was done by teams of mathematicians and linguists, often working in secret institutes. One notable figure was Igor Kurchatov, a physicist who was later pivotal in the Soviet atomic bomb project. During the war, he worked on methods for demagnetizing ships to protect them from magnetic mines, a practical application of physics to military problems. The talent was there, but it was organized and directed by the state in a much more anonymous and collective fashion. Their successes were just as vital, even if the names of the individuals responsible are lost to history. So, who were the brilliant mathematicians in the secret Soviet institutes, and what breakthroughs did they achieve that are still classified? How much did Soviet code breaking rely on captured materials versus pure cryptanalysis, and how did that ratio change throughout the war? And what deception operations were planned but never executed, and what can they tell us about Soviet strategic thinking? Number 20, could a priest and a dictator find common ground? The Soviet Union was founded on an ideology of state atheism. For 2 decades, the government had actively suppressed religion. And churches were closed, property was confiscated, and priests were persecuted. So one of the most surprising turnarounds of the entire war happened on September 4th, 1943. On that day, Joseph Stalin met with the 3 leading metropolitans of the Russian Orthodox Church at the Kremlin. It was a stunning reversal of policy. By 1943, the tide of the war was turning, but the human cost was astronomical. The government needed every tool it could find to maintain national morale and unity. And they realized that despite years of suppression, religious faith remained a powerful force among the people. The German forces in the territories they occupied had often reopened churches as a propaganda move to win over the local population. The Soviet leadership saw this and understood they were losing a crucial battle for hearts and minds. They needed the church on their side. The meeting between Stalin and Metropolitan Sergius was a pragmatic deal. Stalin agreed to halt the anti-religious persecution. He allowed the church to reopen thousands of parishes, to print religious literature, and to elect a new patriarch of Moscow and all Russia, a position that had been vacant for almost 2 decades. In return, the church would throw its full support behind the war effort, and it did. The newly enthroned Patriarch Sergius issued encyclicals calling on believers to defend the motherland. Priests delivered patriotic sermons. The church even raised vast sums of money from its followers to fund the military. Famously, they funded a tank column named after the medieval hero Dmitry Donskoy. This concordat was a marriage of convenience. For Stalin, it was a cynical but effective move to harness patriotism and create a sense of national unity that transcended communist ideology. For the church, it was a chance for survival and a way to regain a place in society. This revival of the Russian Orthodox Church had a significant impact, not just on domestic morale, but also on foreign policy. It helped to counter the narrative of a godless state and made the Soviet Union a more palatable ally for the Western powers. As detailed by scholars like Walter Kolarz in Religion in the Soviet Union, this wartime revival was a carefully managed affair, but it fundamentally changed the relationship between church and state for decades to come. What was really said during that secret 1943 meeting between Stalin and the Metropolitans beyond the official records? How did rank-and-file Communist Party members who had spent their lives promoting atheism react to this sudden reversal of policy? And what clandestine role did the state security services play in the selection of the new church leadership, ensuring it would remain loyal to the government? Number 19, who was the spy that changed the course of 1941? In the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. German forces were at the gates of Moscow. Every available soldier was needed to defend the capital, but a huge, well-equipped Soviet army was stationed in Siberia and the Far East, numbering over 1 million men. They were there for one reason: to guard against a potential attack from the Empire of Japan. Moving these divisions to Moscow was a colossal gamble. If Japan decided to attack, Siberia would be wide open. The decision to move them rested on one crucial piece of intelligence provided by a single spy. That spy was Richard Sorge. Sorge was a German journalist and a committed communist who had built an incredible espionage ring in Tokyo. His cover was perfect. He was a trusted member of the German embassy in Japan, giving him access to high-level information from both German and Japanese sources. His code name was Ramsay. Throughout 1941, Sorge had been sending urgent warnings back to Moscow about the impending German invasion, even providing a probable date, but he was largely ignored by a skeptical Stalin. His most important contribution came in September 1941 through his contacts, including Hatsumi Ozaki, an advisor to the Japanese Prime Minister. Sorge learned the definitive decision of the Japanese High Command. They had decided to strike south, towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific, to secure oil and other resources. They would not attack the Soviet Union in the north. On September 14th, 1941, Sorge sent what is arguably one of the most important intelligence messages of the war. He confirmed that Japan was not going to invade Siberia. This time, the intelligence was believed. The historian Stuart D. Goldman, in his work on Sorge, emphasizes how this specific piece of information, at this specific moment, was a game changer. Acting on Sorge's report, Stalin authorized the transfer of dozens of fresh, experienced, and well-equipped Siberian divisions from the Far East to the West. These divisions, including troops skilled in winter warfare, began arriving at the Moscow front in October and November. They were the crucial reinforcements that allowed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to launch a surprise counteroffensive in early December 1941. This offensive pushed the exhausted German forces back from the capital and saved Moscow. It was the first major defeat for the German army. Sorge's story did not have a happy ending. His spy ring was uncovered by the Japanese just a month after he sent his vital message. He was arrested in October 1941 and eventually executed in 1944. For years, the Soviet Union denied any connection to him. It was only in 1964 that he was posthumously declared a hero of the Soviet Union. His intelligence, provided at the most critical moment, directly enabled the defense of Moscow and changed the trajectory of the war. What other crucial intelligence did Sorge provide that was ignored or is still classified in Russian archives? How did the internal politics of the Kremlin influence which pieces of Sorge's intelligence were believed and which were dismissed? And what if his final vital message had been intercepted or delayed? Could Moscow have fallen? And number 18, why were Soviet scientists hunting for mold? In the midst of the largest land war in history, with battles raging over thousands of miles, a different kind of battle was being fought in quiet laboratories far from the front. This was the fight against infection. In the first years of the war, a wound from a bullet or shrapnel was often a death sentence. Not from the initial injury, but from the gangrene and sepsis that followed. The Soviet medical service was overwhelmed. They desperately needed an answer. That answer came from a surprising source mold. The discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in Britain was one thing, turning it into a mass-producible drug was another. The Western Allies were already working on this, but the Soviet Union was largely isolated. They had to start from scratch. The effort was led by a remarkable microbiologist, Zinaida Yermolieva. She and her team embarked on a frantic search for a potent strain of the penicillium mold. They looked everywhere, collecting samples from the soil, from damp walls, and even from the Moscow subway. In 1942, she found a promising strain on the wall of a bomb shelter. From this strain, Yermolieva and her colleagues developed the first Soviet version of penicillin, which they called Cristozin. The challenges were immense. They lacked the sophisticated equipment and resources available in the West. They had to improvise methods for cultivating the mold and purifying the drug in makeshift labs, all while the war raged on. The first clinical trials were conducted during the Battle of Stalingrad. the results were dramatic. Our wounded soldiers who were expected to die from infections began to recover. The impact on the Soviet war effort was profound. The introduction of penicillin, even in limited quantities at first, dramatically reduced the mortality rate from infected wounds. According to medical histories of the period, it allowed tens of thousands of wounded soldiers to return to the front, soldiers who would have otherwise died or been permanently disabled. This was a force multiplier. Yermolieva became known as Madame Penicillin, and her work saved countless lives. It was a victory not of tanks or planes, but of microscopes and petri dishes. This scientific front was just as crucial as the military one. What unique challenges did Soviet scientists face in scaling up production compared to their Western counterparts? And what ingenious low-tech solutions did they invent? Are there records of other miracle cures or medical innovations developed out of desperation that have since been forgotten? And how much did the sharing of scientific information about penicillin production, which did happen later in the war, accelerate the Soviet effort, and is the full story of that cooperation known? Number 17, how did art galleries and orchestras become instruments of war? When we think of a nation at war, we think of factories churning out weapons and soldiers marching to the front. We don't often think of poets, painters, and composers. But in the Soviet Union, culture was not a luxury, it was a weapon. The state mobilized its artists. With the same intensity, it mobilized its industry. The goal was to maintain morale, inspire hatred for the enemy, and create a powerful narrative of national resistance and ultimate victory. Perhaps the most famous example is Dmitri Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7, the Leningrad Symphony. Shostakovich began composing it in the city of Leningrad during the terrible siege. He worked as a volunteer firefighter between writing sessions. The score was smuggled out of the besieged city on microfilm. Its most legendary performance took place on August 9th, 1942 in Leningrad itself. The city was starving. The orchestra was emaciated. Only a handful of the original musicians were still alive and able to play. To ensure the performance wasn't interrupted by shelling, the Soviet military commander of the city, Leonid Govorov, ordered a preliminary bombardment of enemy artillery positions. The symphony was broadcast over loudspeakers to the enemy lines. It was a defiant act of artistic resistance. But it wasn't just classical music. Popular songs were incredibly important. Songs like The Sacred War, Svyashenaya Voyna became unofficial national anthems, played on the radio constantly, its stirring melody calling the people to defend their land. Another famous song, Katyusha, a folk song about a girl longing for her beloved soldier, became an inspiration for the nickname of the new Soviet rocket launchers. These songs provided a shared emotional language for a nation in crisis. Visual arts were also crucial. The TASS windows were a unique form of propaganda. These were large posters created by a team of artists and writers that were displayed in the windows of the TASS news agency in Moscow. They were produced quickly, often overnight, to respond to the latest news from the front. They used bold graphics and simple, powerful text to mock the enemy and celebrate Soviet heroes. Artists like Kukrynyksy, a collective of 3 cartoonists, became famous for their sharp political satire. Photography also played a key role, with photojournalists like Yevgeny Khalday capturing some of AHI's most iconic images of the war. As detailed by scholars like Rosalinde Sartori in The Stalinist Art of Living, this state-controlled art was a powerful tool for shaping public perception and steeling the nation for the immense sacrifices required. What debates and conflicts took place within the artistic community about the line between patriotic art and pure propaganda? How many works of art were created that were deemed too pessimistic or ideologically unsound by the censors and were subsequently destroyed or hidden? And what was the personal price paid by artists who were expected to produce heroic and optimistic work while living through unimaginable personal tragedy? Number 16, could a swamp be a fortress? When the German army invaded in 1941, it quickly overran vast territories. But conquering the land and controlling it were 2 different things. Behind the front lines, a massive and highly organized partisan movement sprang up. This wasn't just a few scattered groups of resistors. It became a centrally controlled second front that tied down hundreds of thousands of enemy troops and wreaked havoc on their supply lines. And the partisans' greatest ally was the landscape itself, the dense forests and vast swamps of Belarus and Western Russia. These impenetrable regions became partisan strongholds. The Pripyat Marshes, one of the largest wetlands in Europe, became a virtual partisan republic. German armored columns could not operate there. Large-scale anti-partisan operations were incredibly difficult. From these bases, the partisans launched raids. Their primary target was the railway system. The war on the Eastern Front was a war of logistics, and the German army depended on a long and vulnerable network of railways to supply its troops. Partisans became experts at what they called rail war. They derailed supply trains, blew up bridges, and destroyed tracks. In a coordinated effort during Operation Bagration, in 1944, Belarusian partisans carried out tens of thousands of demolitions on the rail network, completely paralyzing German logistics just as the main Soviet offensive began. The partisan movement was not a spontaneous uprising. It was directed from Moscow. In 1942, the central headquarters of the partisan movement was established, under the command of Panteleimon Ponomarenko. This headquarters coordinated the activities of the various partisan detachments. They sent in organizers, radio operators, and demolition experts. They supplied them with weapons and explosives by air. Famous partisan commanders like Sidor Kovpak led long-range raids deep into enemy territory. These were not small bands. Some partisan brigades numbered in the thousands, complete with their own cavalry units, and even makeshift airfields in the forest clearings. The movement included a wide cross-section of society. It was made up of Red Army soldiers who had been cut off, local civilians, and even entire collective farms that had retreated into the woods. Women played a crucial role, often serving as medics, radio operators, and scouts. The historian Kenneth Slepian, in his work on the partisan movement, highlights the complex social dynamics within these forest communities. They created a parallel society with its own rules, hospitals, and even schools for the children. This war behind the lines was brutal and unforgiving, but it was a vital component of the overall Soviet strategy. It drained enemy resources, provided crucial intelligence, and demonstrated that even occupied territory was not truly conquered. What was the true extent of conflict and collaboration between different partisan groups, some of whom had competing political loyalties? How did the central command in Moscow resolve disputes or deal with partisan commanders who became too independent or brutal? And what undiscovered caches of partisan documents buried in the forests for safekeeping might still exist, holding first-hand accounts of this shadow war. Number 15, how did a nation feed an army when its breadbasket was gone? In 1941, the Soviet Union lost control of its most fertile land. The invasion swallowed up Ukraine, the country's breadbasket, along with other key agricultural regions in the south. This created a catastrophic food crisis. The country lost a massive percentage of its grain production, its sugar beet fields, and its livestock. The challenge was monumental: how to feed an army of millions and a civilian population of over 100 million on what was left. The story of the Soviet home front is a story of hunger, rationing, and incredible ingenuity. The immediate response was a strict and brutal system of rationing. Food was allocated based on one's importance to the war effort. Factory workers in critical industries received more than office workers. Soldiers, of course, had priority. The civilian rations, especially in cities like Leningrad, were reduced to starvation levels. The government also relied on forced grain procurements from the collective farms that remained under its control, often leaving the farmers themselves with barely enough to survive. But control wasn't enough. They had to produce more with less. A massive effort was made to expand agriculture in the east, in regions like Siberia and Kazakhstan. These areas had harsher climates and less fertile soil, but every available plot of land was cultivated. The workforce on these farms was now composed almost entirely of women, children, and the elderly, as most of the able-bodied men were at the front. They worked with primitive equipment, often relying on hand tools and animal power because the tractors had been requisitioned by the army. The urban dwellers also played a part. A vast victory garden movement was encouraged. Every spare patch of land in and around cities, parks, squares, roadside sources was turned into a vegetable plot known as an ogorod. These small gardens provided a critical supplement to the meager rations and likely made the difference between survival and starvation for millions of families. The historian William Moskoff, in The Bread of Affliction, documents how this decentralized, small-scale farming became essential to the urban food supply. Lend-Lease aid from the Allies also played a role, as mentioned earlier. The millions of tons of American flour, sugar, and canned meat were vital. This food was primarily directed to the army, which in turn freed up domestic supplies for the civilian population. The struggle for food was a constant, grueling battle that lasted the entire war. It was a battle fought by women on collective farms, by children in victory gardens, and by the logistics officers trying to get supplies to the front. It was a battle won through a combination of brutal state control, community-level improvisation, and foreign aid. What was the real, unrecorded death toll from starvation and malnutrition in areas far from the front lines, which were last in the priority chain for food? How did the black market for food actually function, and to what extent did local officials tolerate or participate in it? And what long-term agricultural knowledge was lost when an entire generation of male farmers was wiped out, leaving the work to those who had to learn on the job. Number 14, were there more women in combat than in any other army in history? The image of the Soviet soldier in World War II is typically male, but this picture is dramatically incomplete. The Soviet Union mobilized its women for the war effort on a scale unprecedented in modern history. They didn't just work in factories and on farms, they served on the front lines in combat roles. Nearly 1 million women served in the armed forces, a number far higher than in any other country involved in the conflict. Their roles were incredibly varied. As mentioned, they served as pilots in the famous Night Witches and other air regiments, but they were also on the ground in the thick of the fighting. The Soviet Union was the only major combatant nation to officially deploy women as snipers. The most famous was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who was credited with over 300 confirmed kills. She became a national hero and was even sent on a goodwill tour to the United States and Canada. These women went through the same grueling training as their male counterparts and endured the same harsh conditions at the front. Thousands of women served in tank crews as machine gunners and in partisan units. A very large number, over 300,000, served as medics and nurses. But in the Red Army, being a medic was a combat role. They were on the front lines, under fire, responsible for dragging wounded soldiers from the battlefield. The casualty rates for these medics were extremely high. Many were killed or wounded while trying to save others. This mass participation of women was born of desperation. The immense losses of 1941 and 1942 created a severe manpower shortage. The state had to tap into every available human resource, but it also drew on a pre-war ideology of equality, at least in theory. The writer Svetlana Alexievich, in her Nobel Prize-winning book, The Unwomanly Face of War, collected the oral histories of hundreds of these female veterans. Their stories reveal the immense physical and psychological toll of the war. They speak of the struggle to be taken seriously by male soldiers, the practical difficulties of being a woman in a male-dominated environment, and the trauma of combat. After the war, many of these women found their contributions downplayed or ignored. They were encouraged to return to traditional roles, and their stories of heroism were often silenced. It was a history that the official male-centric narrative of the war had little room for. What was the real rate of resistance from male commanders to having women in their units, and how was it overcome? How did the experience of combat change these women's perceptions of themselves and their role in society after the war? And what are the stories of the thousands of women who were taken as prisoners of war? A topic that remains deeply under-researched and unspoken. Number 13, how do you design the perfect tank in the middle of a crisis? The T-34 is arguably the most famous tank of the Second World War. When it first appeared on the battlefield in 1941, it came as a rude shock to the German army. It had a powerful gun, thick, sloped armor that caused shells to bounce off, and wide tracks that allowed it to move easily through the mud and snow of the Eastern Front. It was a revolutionary design, but the story of the T-34 isn't just about a single moment of genius. It's about a continuous process of ruthless simplification and mass production that allowed the Soviet Union to build tanks faster than they could be destroyed. The original designer of the T-34 was Mikhail Koshkin, who worked at the Kharkov locomotive factory. He and his design team developed the prototype, the A-32, just before the war. A key feature was the use of the Christie suspension system, which gave it excellent cross-country mobility. Another was the decision to use a diesel engine, which was less prone to catching fire than a gasoline engine. Koshkin famously drove his prototypes over 2,000 kilometers to Moscow to demonstrate them to the leadership. The effort took a toll on his health, and he died shortly after the tank was approved for production. But the T-34 of 1941 was not the same as the T-34 of 1944. The war forced constant evolution. The original design was effective, but it was also complex to manufacture. As factories were evacuated and skilled labor became scarce, the design had to be simplified. The process was overseen by engineers like Alexander Morozov. They made thousands of small changes to make the tank cheaper and faster to build. Welds were made rougher. Non-essential parts were eliminated. The goal was quantity over quality. A T-34 might have a shorter lifespan than its German counterpart, but the Soviets could build 5 or 10 of them for every one Tiger or Panther. This philosophy of mass production was centered in the new industrial cities of the Urals like Chelyabinsk-Tankograd. As described by historian Stephen J. Zaloga in ET 34-85 versus Pietzen KPFW v. Panther, the factories ran 24/7, with women and children making up a large part of the workforce. They churned out tens of thousands of T-34s. Later in the war, the design was upgraded with a more powerful 85mm gun and a larger 3-man turret, creating the T-34-85. This version addressed many of the earlier models' shortcomings, such as poor crew visibility and a cramped turret. The story of the T-34 is a lesson in wartime engineering. It wasn't about building the single best tank, but about building a very good tank in enormous numbers. What design flaws in the T-34 were known to the engineers, but were never fixed because they would have slowed down production. How much did feedback from tank crews on the front line actually influence the design changes made in the factories? And what alternative tank designs were proposed and rejected during the war, and could any of them have been even more effective than the T-34? Number 12, why was a frozen lake the most important road in the world? For 872 days, the city of Leningrad was under siege. Cut off from the rest of the country by invading forces, its millions of citizens faced starvation, shelling, and the brutal cold of the Russian winter. The only lifeline to the besieged city was a precarious route across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga. It was known as the Road of Life. This makeshift ice road was the city's only source of food, fuel, and military supplies, and the only way to evacuate the sick and starving. The road began operating in November 1941 as soon as the lake ice was thick enough to support a truck. It was an incredibly dangerous route. The road was constantly under artillery fire and air attack from German forces who controlled the southern shore of the lake. The ice itself was a constant hazard. It could crack under the weight of the trucks, sending them and their precious cargo into the freezing water. Drivers had to navigate in blizzard conditions, often with their doors open, so they would have a chance to escape if their truck broke through the ice. The organization of the Road of Life was a massive undertaking. Teams of soldiers and civilians worked around the clock to maintain the ice, flooding it to make it thicker and marking the safest routes with posts. Anti-aircraft guns were set up on the ice to provide some protection. Traffic controllers, mostly young women, stood for hours in the freezing cold, guiding the convoys. The drivers, many of them just teenagers, made trip after trip, often driving for days with little sleep. The amount of supplies brought in seemed small compared to the city's needs, but it was enough to keep Leningrad alive. As detailed in Harrison Salisbury's epic book, The 900 Days, the road allowed the city to hold out. During the first winter, it brought in enough food to slightly increase the starvation rations. It also allowed for the evacuation of over 500,000 civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly who were most at risk. In the summer, when the ice melted, the route was maintained by a flotilla of small boats and barges, which were just as vulnerable to attack. The Road of Life was more than just a supply line, it was a symbol of the city's will to survive. It demonstrated incredible human resilience and ingenuity in the face of unimaginable hardship. What classified military intelligence was used to predict ice thickness and weather conditions on the lake to keep the road open? How many drivers and vehicles were actually lost on the road, and is the official number an underestimate? And what personal diaries or memoirs from the young women who served as traffic controllers on the ice still exist, offering a ground-level view of this incredible operation? Number 11. Could a rocket launcher be built without a rocket scientist? One of the most iconic and feared Soviet weapons of the war was the Katyusha rocket launcher. German soldiers called it Stalin's organ because of the howling sound the rockets made as they were fired and the visual resemblance of the launch rails to a church organ. A salvo from a battery of Katyushas could devastate a large area in seconds, delivering a massive amount of high explosives. It was a terrifying psychological weapon as well as a destructive one, but the story of its development is one of improvisation and simplicity. The development of solid fuel rockets had been underway in the Soviet Union since the 1930s at places like the Gas Dynamics Laboratory in Leningrad. A key figure was Georgy Langemak. However, the program was severely disrupted by the political purges of the late 1930s. Many of the top scientists, including Langemak, were arrested and executed. This meant that when the war began, the rocket technology existed, but much of the top-level expertise was gone. The team that brought the Katyusha to fruition had to work with the existing and somewhat unrefined technology. The brilliance of the Katyusha system was its simplicity. The rocket itself, the RS-132, was a simple, fin-stabilized rocket. It was not very accurate. Individual rockets were unlikely to hit a specific target, but that was not the point. The idea was to fire a large number of them at once to saturate an area. The launcher was even simpler. It was just a set of parallel steel rails called a multiple rocket launcher, or MRL, that could be mounted on the back of a truck. This was a key innovation. By mounting the launcher on a truck, usually a Lend-Lease Studebaker, the Katyusha became highly mobile. A battery could drive to a position, fire a massive salvo, and then quickly move away before the enemy could locate them and fire back. This shoot and scoot tactic was very effective. The first experimental battery of Katyushas, commanded by Captain Ivan Flerov, saw action in July 1941. They fired on a railway station packed with German troops and supplies, causing massive destruction and panic. The effect was so impressive that the weapon was immediately rushed into mass production. The factories that built them used simple manufacturing techniques, allowing them to be produced in huge numbers. The Katyusha was not a precision weapon, it was a blunt instrument. But on the vast battlefields of the Eastern Front, its ability to deliver a shocking amount of firepower quickly and cheaply made it one of the most effective weapons of the war. What simplified rocket fuel formulas were developed during the war when certain chemicals became unavailable. How were the targeting calculations for this inherently inaccurate weapon developed, and how much was it just point and shoot? And are there any surviving documents from the design bureaus that show what the next generation of rocket artillery would have looked like if the war had continued? Number 10, how much of the war was fought by children? The image of the Soviet war effort often focuses on adult soldiers and workers, but a huge and often overlooked part of the workforce, and even the armed forces, was made up of children and teenagers. With millions of men at the front and millions of women also mobilized for factories and agriculture, the state turned to its youngest citizens to fill the gaps. The war profoundly and brutally reshaped the meaning of childhood. In the factories, especially those that had been evacuated to the Urals and Siberia, children as young as 12 worked grueling 12-hour shifts. They stood on wooden boxes to reach the machinery. They produced ammunition, assembled weapons, and worked on the tank production lines. Their small hands were sometimes considered ideal for delicate assembly work. The conditions were harsh, with little food and inadequate safety measures. These children were hailed in propaganda as heroes of the home front, but the reality was one of forced, exhausting labor. Historians like Lisa Kirschenbaum in The Legacy of the Siege of Leningrad describe how the line between child and adult essentially dissolved under the pressures of total war. On the collective farms, the situation was similar. With the men gone, children became a primary source of labor. They operated machinery, tended livestock, and worked long hours during the harvest. Their contribution was essential to the food production that kept the country from total collapse. Perhaps most shockingly, many children and teenagers participated directly in the conflict. Some, known as sons of the regiment, were orphans who were unofficially adopted by military units. They served as messengers, scouts, or assistants. Many teenagers, driven by patriotism or revenge for lost families, lied about their age to enlist in the army. Thousands more joined the partisan movement. In the forests and swamps behind enemy lines, these young partisans served as reconnaissance scouts, saboteurs, and couriers. Their small size and local knowledge often made them particularly effective. This was not a story of a few exceptional cases, it was a widespread phenomenon. And the state actively encouraged this participation through youth organizations like the Komsomol. The war forced a generation of Soviet children to grow up almost overnight, taking on responsibilities and facing horrors that no child should ever have to experience. What was the real number of child laborers who died from industrial accidents, malnutrition, and exhaustion, figures that were never officially recorded? What psychological support, if any, was offered to these child soldiers and workers after the war to help them deal with their trauma? And what happened to the sons of the regiment when the war ended and their military families were demobilized? Number 9, what did the Soviet Union gain from a secret war in Spain? The Second World War did not begin in a vacuum. The years leading up to it were filled with smaller conflicts and political maneuvering that set the stage for the larger confrontation. For the Soviet Union, one of the most important of these dress rehearsals was the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. On the surface, the Soviet Union was simply providing aid to the Spanish Republic against a nationalist uprising. But underneath, it was a secret war, a testing ground for weapons, tactics, and people. The Soviet Union sent military aid to the Spanish Republic, but it did so covertly. Officially, they maintained neutrality. In reality, they sent several thousand military advisors, including pilots, tank commanders, and intelligence officers. These were not just observers, they were active participants. Soviet pilots, flying Soviet-made Polikarpov F-15 and I-16 fighters, engaged in dogfights with pilots from the German and Italian air forces who were supporting the other side. This was the first time these new aircraft designs were tested in real combat. The same was true for tanks. The Soviets sent their T-26 and BT-5 tanks. Tank commanders like General Dmitry Pavlov gained their first combat experience in Spain, testing out theories of armored warfare. The lessons learned were mixed. The tanks performed well, but they also proved vulnerable to anti-tank guns. The experience in Spain heavily influenced Soviet tank design and doctrine in the years immediately following, as detailed by military historians like Antony Beevor in The Battle for Spain. Beyond the hardware, Spain was a training ground for people. Future famous commanders of the Second World War, like Rodion Malinovsky and Kirill Meretskov, served as advisors in Spain. It was also a major theater for Soviet intelligence operations. The NKVD was highly active, both in fighting the enemy and in purging rival leftist factions within the Republican side. This experience honed their skills in covert operations and political infiltration. However, the lessons from Spain were not all positive. The purges that were sweeping the Soviet Union at the same time had a devastating effect. Many of the experienced officers who returned from Spain, like Pavlov, were later arrested and executed, and their hard-won knowledge was lost. Furthermore, the Soviet leadership drew some wrong conclusions from the conflict, underestimating the effectiveness of large, coordinated armored formations. But despite the mixed results, the Spanish Civil War provided the Red Army and Air Force with invaluable, if costly, combat experience. It was a brutal preview of the much larger conflict that was to come. What specific technical flaws in Soviet aircraft and tanks were discovered in Spain, and how did they directly lead to the designs of the next generation of weapons? How much did the NKVD's activities in Spain, focused on internal purges, undermine the military effectiveness of the Republican forces they were supposed to be helping? And what secret agreements were made between the Soviet Union and the Spanish Republic regarding the transfer of Spain's gold reserves to Moscow in payment for the military aid? And number 8, how did a scorched earth save a nation? When the German invasion began in June 1941, the Soviet leadership quickly realized the catastrophic speed of the enemy advance. In a radio address on July 3rd, Stalin announced a new brutal policy for the territories that were about to be lost, a scorched earth policy. The idea was simple and ruthless. If territory had to be abandoned, nothing of value was to be left for the enemy. Everything that could not be evacuated had to be destroyed. This was a policy of total and systematic destruction. As the Red Army retreated, special destruction battalions followed behind them. They blew up bridges, tore up railway tracks, and destroyed factories and power plants that could not be moved. They burned fields of crops and slaughtered livestock to deny food to the invading army. Grain elevators were set on fire. Coal mines were flooded. The goal was to leave the enemy a barren wasteland, a territory that would consume their resources rather than replenish them. This policy had a devastating impact on the German army's logistics. They had planned for a short war and had expected to live off the land using the agricultural and industrial resources of the occupied territories. The scorched earth policy made this impossible. Instead of gaining resources, they had to ship everything, food, fuel, and supplies from Germany along increasingly long and vulnerable supply lines, which were being harassed by partisans. This logistical strain was a major factor in slowing down their advance and was particularly critical during the winter of 1941, when the German supply system neared collapse. The human cost of this policy for the Soviet people was immense. The civilians who were left behind in the occupied territories were stripped of their food and shelter by their own government before the enemy even arrived. The policy was a calculated and brutal sacrifice of the population in the path of the invasion for the sake of the nation's survival as a whole. As described by historians like Richard Overy in Russia's War, it was a demonstration of the Soviet regime's capacity for utter ruthlessness, not just towards its enemies, but towards its own citizens in the pursuit of victory. It was a terrible choice, but from a purely strategic perspective, it played a significant role in robbing the invasion of its momentum and turning a short campaign into a long war of attrition that the German economy could not sustain. What was the unwritten protocol for deciding which towns and villages were to be completely destroyed and which were to be spared? How much resistance was there from local populations who saw their homes and livelihoods being destroyed by their own retreating army? And what was the long-term ecological damage caused by the widespread and deliberate destruction of infrastructure and agriculture across thousands of square miles? Number 7 were penal battalions, just a form of execution. One of the most brutal and controversial aspects of the Red Army was the use of Strafbats, or penal battalions. These were units composed of soldiers and officers who had been convicted of crimes or political offenses, or who had breached military discipline. Instead of being sent to a prison camp, they were sent to the front to redeem themselves with blood. It was a way for the state to get some military use out of its condemned men. The official order creating these units, Order Number 227, issued by Stalin in July 1942, was famously known as the Not One Step Back Order. It was issued at a moment of extreme crisis as Soviet forces were reeling back towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The order decreed that any soldier who retreated without orders was to be considered a traitor. It authorized the creation of blocking detachments at the rear to shoot panickers and cowards, and it established the penal battalions. Officers who had failed were sent to penal battalions, while enlisted men were sent to separate penal companies. Life in a Strafbat was incredibly grim. They were given the most dangerous and suicidal missions. They were used to spearhead attacks on heavily fortified German positions, to conduct reconnaissance in force, and to clear minefields by simply walking through them. The casualty rates were astronomical, far higher than in regular units. The idea was that service in a penal battalion was a temporary punishment. If a soldier was wounded, his sentence was considered served, and if he survived long enough, he could be restored to his rank and returned to a regular unit. But very few survived long enough for that to happen. These units were not just filled with criminals. They included political prisoners, soldiers who had been captured and escaped, and officers who had simply failed in a previous command. For the high command, it was a way to enforce discipline through terror and to use men they considered expendable for the most costly tasks. The historian Edwin P. Hoyt in Stalin's War describes the Strafbats as a uniquely ruthless tool of a regime that held individual human life in very low regard. While they certainly contributed to the war effort by taking on missions no one else would, they represent one of the darkest chapters of the Red Army's history. What was the actual process for assigning soldiers to a penal battalion, and how much of it was based on arbitrary decisions by local commanders? Are there any reliable statistics on the survival rates in these units, or were the records deliberately obscured? And what happened to the very few men who did survive their service in a penal battalion? Were they truly accepted back into regular units, or were they forever marked by the stigma? Number 6. How did Stalin's pre-war purges actually help the war effort? The conventional wisdom is that the Great Purge of the Red Army in 1937 to 1938 was an unmitigated disaster. Stalin's paranoia led to the arrest and execution of a huge portion of the senior officer corps, 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, thousands of high-ranking commanders, and a majority of the divisional and corps commanders were eliminated. This decapitation of the military leadership is widely seen as a primary reason for the Red Army's catastrophic performance in the first year of the war in 1941. And while this is largely true, there is a less known and more controversial counter-argument. The argument put forward by some revisionist military historians like Roger R. Rees in The Soviet Military Experience is not that the purges were good, but that they had an unintended and, in a strange way, positive side effect. The old officer corps that was eliminated was in many ways a product of the Russian Civil War. While experienced, some were also politically unreliable and resistant to new military doctrines, particularly the theories of deep battle being advocated by younger, more forward-thinking officers like Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky. The purges, by brutally clearing out the top ranks, created a vacuum. This allowed a new, younger generation of officers to be promoted at an incredibly rapid rate. Men who were colonels one year found themselves commanding divisions or even armies the next. These men, like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky, were often more open to innovation. They had risen through the ranks based on merit and political loyalty, and they were the ones who would eventually lead the Red Army to victory. The purges, in essence, accidentally accelerated a generational change in the military leadership. This new generation of commanders made terrible mistakes in 1941 and 1942. They lacked the experience of their predecessors and had been promoted far beyond their level of competence. The price of their on-the-job training was paid in the blood of millions of soldiers. However, they learned quickly from their mistakes. By 1943, they had become a hardened and highly effective group of commanders, masters of large-scale operational art. The argument is that the older, more conservative officer corps, had it survived, might have been even less capable of adapting to the realities of modern mechanized warfare. It's a deeply uncomfortable idea that a monstrous act of political violence inadvertently paved the way for the military leadership that would ultimately win the war. What was the true extent of resistance to new military doctrines among the officers who were purged, and is there evidence to support the idea that they were holding the army back? How did the rapid promotion of junior officers affect the morale and discipline of the units they suddenly commanded? And what if the purges had never happened? Would a more experienced, but perhaps more rigid Red Army have fared better or worse in 1941? Number 5. Did Soviet intelligence build the American atomic bomb? This question sounds like hyperbole, but it gets at a startling truth. The Soviet Union's intelligence network inside the Manhattan Project was astonishingly successful. While American and British scientists were racing to build the first atomic bomb in secret locations like Los Alamos, Soviet spies were looking over their shoulders the entire time. The Soviet Union's own atomic bomb project, which began in earnest in 1943 under the leadership of Igor Kurchatov, was given an incredible head start by this espionage. The network of spies was extensive. It included high-level scientists within the project itself. The most famous was Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant German-born physicist who was part of the British delegation at Los Alamos. He was a committed communist and passed on a vast amount of crucial technical information to his Soviet handlers. This included detailed designs for the plutonium bomb, the Fat Man device. He provided the core calculations and engineering specifications that would have taken Soviet scientists years to figure out on their own. But Fuchs was not alone. Other key sources included Theodore Hall, a young prodigy physicist at Los Alamos, and David Greenglass, an army machinist who provided details on the high explosive lenses used to trigger the bomb. This intelligence was funneled back to Moscow through a network of couriers. The information was so detailed and accurate that when Kurchatov's team was struggling with a particular design problem, the head of the NKVD, Lavrenti Beria, would sometimes produce a file of stolen American documents that contained the solution. This is documented in books like The Haunted Wood by Alan Weinstein and Alexander Vasiliev. The intelligence was a blueprint. The success of this espionage dramatically accelerated the Soviet atomic program. The first Soviet atomic bomb, detonated in 1949, was a near-exact copy of the American plutonium bomb. This shocked the United States, which had expected to have a nuclear monopoly for at least another decade. The speed of the Soviet achievement was not solely due to espionage. They had excellent scientists of their own. But the intelligence allowed them to avoid dead ends, confirm their theories, and focus their resources on a proven design. It saved them years of research and development. The race for nuclear arms, which would define the next 50 years of world history, began with one of the most successful intelligence operations of all time. What other still unknown sources did the Soviet Union have inside the Manhattan Project? How much did the political leadership in Moscow truly understand the scientific information they were receiving, or were they just passing papers to their physicists? And what if this espionage had been discovered in 1944? How would a world in which only the United States possessed nuclear weapons for a decade or more have been different? Number 4, why did the Red Army keep fighting after Berlin fell? The capture of Berlin and the final German surrender in May 1945 is the symbolic end of the war in Europe. But for hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers, the fighting was not over. In the days and weeks that followed the official surrender, a series of violent and largely forgotten battles took place, most notably in and around the city of Prague. The situation was complex. As the main German army surrendered to the Western Allies and the Soviets, a massive German Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner, was still intact in what was then the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Schorner was a fanatical follower of the defeated regime, and he refused to surrender to the Soviets. His plan was to fight his way west in order to surrender his 1 million men to the Americans rather than face Soviet captivity. At the same time, on May 5th, 1945, the citizens of Prague rose up against the German occupation. This was the Prague Uprising. The Czech resistance fighters were poorly armed and desperately needed help. They broadcast pleas for assistance, which were heard by both the advancing Soviet and American armies. The American forces under General Patton were closer, but were ordered to halt at an agreed-upon demarcation line. The task of liberating Prague and dealing with Army Group Center fell to the Red Army. The Soviets launched the Prague Offensive on May 6th. 3 massive army groups, commanded by Marshals Ivan Konev, Rodion Malinovsky, and Andrei Yeryomenko, converged on the city. They advanced rapidly, aiming to encircle Army Group Center and prevent its escape to the west. The final major battles took place after the official VE Day. Red Army tanks entered Prague on May 9th, greeted as liberators by the cheering population. The fighting continued until May 11th and 12th, as the remnants of Army Group Center were trapped and destroyed or forced to surrender. This final operation, as described by military historian John Erickson in The Road to Berlin, was a bloody postscript to the war, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, all after the official peace had been declared. It was a stark reminder that the end of a war is rarely a clean and tidy affair. What secret communications, if any, passed between the American and Soviet commanders regarding the halt order and the fate of Army Group Center? How many smaller, unrecorded skirmishes took place across Central Europe in the chaotic days after the surrender as isolated units refused to give up? And what was the full political story behind the decision to cede the liberation of Prague to the Red Army, and how did it shape the post-war fate of Czechoslovakia? Number 3, how did defeat in Finland save the Soviet Union? In the winter of 1939 to 1940, the Soviet Union invaded its small neighbor Finland. On paper, it should have been an easy victory. The Red Army had overwhelming superiority in troops, tanks, and aircraft. But the Winter War, as it became known, was a humiliating disaster for the Soviets. The small, highly motivated Finnish army, fighting on its home turf, inflicted staggering casualties on the invaders. The Red Army was poorly led, its troops were ill-equipped for winter warfare, and its tactics were clumsy and ineffective. The world watched in shock as the Soviet military machine faltered, the Finns using Mahdi tactics, chopping up larger enemy forces into small, isolated pockets, and the skills of soldiers on skis ran circles around the road-bound Soviet divisions. Eventually, the sheer weight of Soviet numbers forced Finland to sue for peace in ceded territory. But the Red Army had paid an incredible price in blood for its victory. The performance was so poor that it convinced many observers, including those in the German high command, that the Soviet military was a paper tiger. And this is where the strange, unintended consequence comes in. The humiliation of the Winter War was a brutal wake-up call for the Soviet leadership. It exposed all the deep-seated weaknesses in the Red Army that had been papered over. The purges had destroyed the officer corps, training was poor, and equipment was inadequate. As a result of the Finnish fiasco, the Kremlin initiated a series of frantic reforms. The system of dual command, where military officers had their orders countersigned by a political commissar, was temporarily abolished, giving commanders more authority. And training programs were overhauled with a new emphasis on realistic combat conditions. New and better equipment, including winter clothing and white camouflage, was developed and issued. Perhaps most importantly, some of the more competent officers who had been imprisoned during the purges were released and reinstated. Konstantin Rokossovsky was one such officer. In short, the disaster in Finland forced the Red Army to begin the painful process of modernizing and professionalizing itself. As detailed by historians like William R. Trotter in A Frozen Hell, the lessons learned were critical. Had the Winter War not happened, or had it been an easy victory, the Red Army might have entered the much larger conflict of 1941 with all of its deep flaws still unaddressed. The defeat in Finland, in a terrible way, helped to prepare the Soviet Union for the greater struggle to come. It exposed the rot and forced a course correction that, while incomplete by 1941, was vital for the Army's eventual survival and recovery. What specific tactical reports from the Winter War were studied by the Soviet General Staff, and which lessons were implemented versus which were ignored? How much did the poor performance in Finland embolden the German leadership in their decision to invade the Soviet Union a year and a half later? And what were the stories of the individual Soviet soldiers who, having survived the Finnish campaign, tried to warn their superiors about the Army's deep-seated problems? Number 2, who really controlled the armies, the generals, or the commissars? A unique feature of the Red Army was the institution of the political commissar. Every military unit, from the company level up, had a political officer assigned to it. This commissar was the representative of the Communist Party. His job was to ensure the political loyalty of the troops and their commander, to conduct political education, and to maintain morale. In the early years of the war, the system of dual command was in place. This meant that the military commander's orders were only valid if they were also signed by the commissar. This created a situation ripe for conflict and inefficiency. The relationship between the commander and the commissar was often tense. The commander was responsible for military tactics and operations, while the commissar was responsible for the political reliability of the unit. But the lines often blurred. A commissar could, and often did, interfere in military decisions if he felt they were politically suspect or showed a lack of fighting spirit. A cautious commander who wanted to make a tactical withdrawal could be overruled by a commissar who saw it as cowardice or treason. This system, as described in works by military sociologists like Roger Rees, often led to disastrous military outcomes as political zeal trumped sound military judgment. The role of the commissar was a product of the regime's deep-seated distrust of its own military. The leaders feared that a professional officer corps could become a rival power center. The commissar was the party's watchdog, there to ensure the army served the state's political goals above all else. They were the eyes and ears of the party within the military. They reported on the mood of the soldiers and the reliability of the officers. As the war progressed and the need for military efficiency became paramount, the role of the commissar changed. The disastrous defeats of 1941 and 1942 showed that the dual command system was unworkable. In October 1942, Stalin abolished it and established the principle of unity of command. The military commander was given sole authority and responsibility for his unit. The commissars were not eliminated, but their role was changed. They became deputies for political affairs, focused more on morale, propaganda, and personnel issues rather than co-commanders. This was a critical reform that allowed professional military officers like Zhukov and Rokossovsky to do their jobs without constant political interference. It was a pragmatic admission that in a fight for survival, military expertise had to take precedence over political ideology. What secret reports did commissars send back to Moscow about the famous generals they were assigned to, and how much did these reports influence the generals' careers? How many tactical disasters on the battlefield can be directly attributed to a commissar overruling a competent military commander in the early years of the war? And what happened to the thousands of hardline commissars when their power was suddenly curtailed in 1942? Number one, why did geography, not generals, win the war? We often attribute the Soviet victory to famous generals like Zhukov, the resilience of the people, or the sheer number of T-34 tanks. All were important, but perhaps the most powerful and implacable ally the Soviet Union had was its own geography. The immense size of the country and its brutal climate were weapons in themselves, weapons that no enemy had ever been able to overcome. First, there is the sheer scale of the country. The Eastern Front was not like the Western Front. It was a theater of operations of almost unimaginable size. The front line stretched for thousands of miles. This vastness swallowed up armies. The German invasion in 1941, despite its rapid advance, found that the further it went, the more stretched its supply lines became, and the more its forces were diluted across the immense space. There was always more land to conquer. Capturing Moscow, as Napoleon had discovered, did not mean capturing Russia. The country's strategic depth allowed the Soviets to trade space for time. They could retreat for hundreds of miles, evacuating industry and mobilizing new armies, and still have a country left to defend. Then there is the climate. The Russian winter is legendary. German soldiers equipped for a short summer campaign were completely unprepared for the sub-zero temperatures, the blizzards, and the deep snow. Their equipment froze. Engines wouldn't start. Oil became solid. The soldiers themselves suffered terribly from frostbite. The Red Army, while also suffering, was much better prepared for winter conditions. They had warmer clothing, and their equipment was designed to operate in the cold. The winter of 1941 was a key factor in halting the advance on Moscow, but it wasn't just the winter. There was also the Rasputitsa, the spring and autumn mud seasons. During these periods, the unpaved roads of Russia and Ukraine dissolved into a sea of impassable mud. Wheeled vehicles became completely stuck. Even tracked vehicles struggled. This mud bogged down entire armies, halting offensives and creating logistical nightmares. The Soviet T-34 tank, with its wide tracks, was better able to handle the mud than many of its German counterparts. As the historian David Stahel argues in his books on Operation Barbarossa, the invaders were defeated as much by the landscape and the weather as they were by the Red Army itself. The vast plains, the impenetrable forests, the frozen winters, and the muddy springs were all silent participants in the conflict, shaping every battle and every campaign. They were the ultimate undefeated defenders of the land. What if the initial invasion had occurred a month earlier, in May instead of June? Would that have given the German forces enough time to achieve their objectives before winter set in? How much did pre-war Soviet infrastructure planning, or lack thereof, intentionally rely on the poor road network to act as a defensive barrier? And are there any modern climate studies that can tell us if the winters of 1941 and 1942 were unusually severe, or were they just typical Russian winters that the invaders were unprepared for?